everyone, and thank you for listening to Brain Fruits, the podcast on women changemakers. I'm your host, Hannah Becker, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce you to our first researcher, Christina Gravert. Good morning, Christina. It's a pleasure to have you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Christina is a behavioral economist. She's also the assistant professor of economics at the University of Copenhagen. Further on, she is a co-founder of Impactually. Christina, can you tell us a little bit about your career path as a woman in behavioral science and your interest in nudging?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. And yeah, so I'm currently, as you said, an assistant professor in Copenhagen, where I do research on behavior change. So I'm interested in understanding what motivates people to change behavior, what gets them off track when they have these great intentions, but they don't follow through with them. And then from an economic perspective, of course, I'm interested in understanding how can we design policies that help people change behavior so they can make better decisions for their health, their wealth, their everyday lives. I got into this field a bit by accident. I was reading a book by Dan Ariely, who's a big name in behavioral science, and I never really thought that this is something that I could do research on as an economist, but then I learned that was actually possible. So I started doing a PhD on the subject in 2011. So that's already some time ago. So I did a PhD on experimental economics and was really interested in what motivates people in to give to charity or to give feedback to others, and how do they persevere in face of challenges. I was working on these different types of issues, and then I became a postdoc in Gothenburg for another 4 years, where I got more interested, and we're also working with sustainability questions, environmental questions. How can we get people to eat more climate friendly or to take public transport more? And then in 2018, I came to the University of Copenhagen, and this is where I am right now.
Wow, super interesting and really inspirational. I must say that you read a book a little bit outside of the economics area, and then you find still the bridge over to combine it with economics. That's really, really, really cool.
Yeah, it was kind of lucky. I took a summer school course. It was the very last course of my my studies. It was a little bit extra of the ordinary, and there was a bit about decision making already. And then I started getting into the field, and I was like, wow, I never thought I was going to do a PhD, but I just thought this subject was so interesting. I was like, well, if there's a chance to spend 3 years just thinking about this and doing experiments, then this is what I want to do. And then I thought I'm going to afterwards go into consulting or work somewhere else. And I had never planned to stay at the university. But yeah, there's so much fascinating research still to be done. And I'm still here. So, but then maybe what you also said, I'm also a co-founder of Impactually. So in 2017, I met Nurit Nobel, my co-founder, who was coming more from a management perspective, and me from the university. And then we said we both have this passion to bring out these scientific findings more into the real world, as we would say, right? So bringing them out to people who could actually directly make a difference. And that's when we started the company, and we do lots of different types of consulting projects, but always the aim to say, okay, where can we have the biggest impact on increasing social welfare and welfare of people.
That is a really interesting background, I must say. Talking about decision making, we know that since we humans are such big creatures of habit and tradition, we tend to keep doing what we've always been doing, what we know, right? Until we find something that motivates us to change. Now, this new thriving field in behavioral science has produced a wealth of insights in nudging. So in how to nudge people with gentle little pushes that can help us, that can help to add a big impact. We should mention that the term nudge was coined by 2 leaders in this field, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. In fact, they wrote a book on it, which is called Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. The easiest to explain a nudge to people is that it is a small, discrete intervention that is inspired by insights uncovered through our understanding of human behavior. It guides beneficial behaviors in such a way whereby choice is not limited, so people don't feel forced. Nudges can be carried out through changes to a physical space, by communicating in an intentional way, or simply by including behavioral strategies within any interaction with a group or individuals. For example, you can nudge employee behavior in a meeting simply by being very deliberate about the name of the meeting, by the name of the reading room, or then the timing. This kind of like primes then the participants. Christina, when we talk about some of the problems that we encounter in socioeconomic inequalities, what are some of the problems that behavioral science can help to bridge the widening socioeconomic inequalities?
That's a great question. So, as you said, so maybe we should just also say that behavioral science is the research behind it, is the field of science, and then nudging is a tool that can apply behavioral science to particular decision making. So also when it comes to nudging, it's important to think about it's not actually about changing the humans, but it's changing the context in which humans make decisions. So it takes also a bit away the responsibility of saying, okay, the human needs to change, they need to be more motivated, they need to be more informed, they need to try harder, but actually saying, what is it about the context in which we make decisions that maybe guides people in ways that are not optimal? So when we think about socioeconomic quality, can be that, for example, when it comes to savings, what is it about the environment that people make decisions in that maybe makes it hard to save in the long run? So we know that people might have biases that, we want to all eat the cookie now. And even though we might want to be healthier and live longer, but we're very tempted to do things that are maybe not so good for us, but very pleasurable right now, but then they're maybe not so good in the long run. And that can, of course, be related to savings behavior, but of course also be related to health behavior. We think about medication adherence. So people know they should be taking their medication, but then things get in the way every day. We are inattentive, and then we forget about things, or we just want to do other things with our time, or it feels a bit maybe unpleasant to take the medication. So if we think about all these different areas that we make decision in, that is often health behavior, savings behavior, but also environmental behavior, where we say, okay, what should we be doing right now in order to have a nice planet for future generations? That can be the same thing. It's very easy to litter or to forget something or not recycle or to throw away food that we didn't eat, which can have these very long-term consequences, which we often have a problem of just thinking about. But then, as I said, it's more about changing the context in which we make these decisions rather than trying to convince people that they do need to save and that they should do things that are healthy for them, or that they should take care of the environment.
That's a really good, it's a really interesting insight, I think, that you give here, that it's really important to think about the context in which we make these decisions, and that the behavior that is really driving often these socioeconomic inequalities, right? When we think about savings, I think it's a great example. It's really important that we think about not only the decision-making entities or the human itself, but also about the context that it makes this decision in. Often we think about socioeconomic inequalities as equal to gaps in savings or in income, but it's not the only divergence that we have to bridge, as you mentioned here. When we talk about socioeconomic inequalities, we also can take into consideration different outcome in health, and particularly also in mental health. We know that socioeconomic inequalities, they are labeled as the gravest forces of our current time, and they are pre-existing vulnerabilities that tend to worsen after such macroeconomic shocks as we encounter at the moment with the corona crisis. Particularly, gaps in mental health outcomes tend to widen between socioeconomic groups, with some deleterious consequences such as labor market outcomes, educational attainment, and career opportunities. We already know that before the pandemic, we had staggering rates of mental illness. But this is suspected to be even worse after this pandemic. So we can see that with the COVID-19 consequences for mental health services, they materialize as dramatic reduction in access to and availability of behavioral healthcare, of facility-based services, and community-based support. This leaves some groups worse off, particularly. And here I'm talking about women and young adults. These are groups that have already experienced lower levels of mental well-being before the pandemic, so they were already worse off. Christina, what do you think? How can decision makers use behavioral science and maybe some of the toolboxes from nudging to drive to try to achieve better mental health outcomes, particularly for women?
I think that's an excellent point, and also the um, the idea that we've seen now during the pandemic, how changing the environment we live in has affected mental health outcomes for so many people. So I think that really draws back to what I said before, that sometimes it's not so much about the person trying hard or the person trying to change, but we say the context changes, and that also has an effect on our mental health and other types of health outcomes. So I think that should also then be the remedy, the solution to getting back to it, saying, okay, what can we do about the environment that people are in that can help them to come to better health outcomes. So we know, for example, that exercise can be very good, so that you get outside, you also get some sunlight, you just have a little bit of moderate exercise, healthy eating, and those are things that we can nudge. We can't nudge anybody to be less anxious or to be less depressed. And I think this is also would be too far reaching if behavioral scientists would try to go into the area of that clinical psychology or psychiatry, which is not our role. But what we could do is trying to think about, can we give people really the time during lunchtime to go outside and to go for a walk? Do we have to have a meeting sitting down in a room? Can we do more meetings where it's maybe standing up and taking a walk? Can we supply the canteens with more healthier food or healthier snacks? Can we have, in a way, nudges in our email systems that remind people, do you need to send that email after 5 in the evening, or can you send it, do you want to maybe schedule it for tomorrow at 8? That's, for example, something I think about, saying, do I need to, I mean, I might want to send this out right now, but is somebody else going to feel pressured to answer late in the evening because I sent that email? So then I sometimes schedule the emails for the next morning, so that nobody will feel pressured. Also on the weekend, I don't want my students to feel like they need to respond at that time. And this is of course not going to solve all our problems with mental health, but I think if we add up all these smaller possibilities, then we can really create working environments and also home environments for people that can help kind of steer back against these things that are very, very stressful, anxiety inducing. And I think this is probably relevant to women, but it's also going to be relevant to men, and just in general, what can we do that we have a bit better working environments? And yes, and I think there we want to rely very much on what has already been found within psychology of what works to improve mental health outcomes.
That's a really great example, I think, especially the one with the scheduling of emails. This is something so small that has a big difference. And this is sometimes where I can still fall short, I must say, that, you know, when there's something important coming up and you just feel yourself as an individual, or you have to just get it rid out of your chest as well. But you have to, as you say, also think about, what does it actually do to the recipient? Is it really the time now at 5 p.m. in the evening or 4 p.m. in the afternoon to say, hey, there is something that needs to be taken action on? So it is, I think, a great recommendation to just think about scheduling emails, or even having automatic systems in place where it just says, hey, after 5 p.m., automatically, most of the emails, other than completely, something very, very urgent, will be automatically scheduled for the next morning.
And for example, there you see these nudges being implemented. So I'm not sure if I've seen it directly in this email setting, but there's an interesting study about prescribing medication for doctors. And then often if they want to prescribe a painkiller, they might write paracetamol or a brand. No, that would be like in Denmark, I guess, Alvedon, or a brand name, because that more quickly comes to mind, but then what the system does, it overwrites it to kind of going back to just a basic generic ingredient, because that's often also good enough. And then a pop-up comes or something saying, no, I really mean to prescribe this particular brand instead of just a generic medication. So then that's an idea of this nudge, and that one could do with email, and then say like, okay, by default, as you say, they're not going to be sent out, but then you might have this extra pop-up saying, do you really want to send this out now? And then you can still overwrite it. So the important thing with nudging is also that we never force people, right? We don't want to change the context in a way that people have to take stand-up meetings or they have to go for walks during lunch break. But it's more about how can we reduce friction and make it easier to do these things that we think are good for people, and make it maybe a little bit harder by putting the cookies in the cookie jar and putting a lid on it. It makes them a little bit harder to eat, but it's still possible to eat them if you want to. So it's really about saying we don't want to restrict choices, but if we think about how people are distracted every single day and are not really attentive to things, they have to run from meeting to meeting and do different things, then how can we guide them in ways that that would be good for them without actually forcing them to change anything about their behavior?
That's super interesting. I think we have had a couple of really great examples now of small nudges that we can apply in the professional area. What are some of the biases that we need to take into account when we talk about decision making? The reason that I'm asking is that often in decision making, of course, we all want to make good choices, right? But it's not that easy. Behavioral economists, they always say that they have identified several factors that impact the choices that we make. For instance, I think a very common example is the initial price people perceive for a pair of shoes will become the anchor for future evaluation when buying shoes. So these kind of anchors, as you talked about a little bit, what is it that we need to take into account?
So my 5 favorite biases are the ones that I talk about most when we do workshops, and I also feel that in very many decisions they apply. Is one of them you've already mentioned, this idea of anchoring, which we could also think about as the idea of loss aversion. So humans tend to look more at the negatives of making a choice than the positives. So you might have a reference point, right? You don't really like the job you're at, but the risk of changing and it then maybe being worse than what you have right now then keeps people with the job they have, even though they're not super happy with it. So in experimental studies, we found that usually people need to perceive the upside to be twice as good as the status quo in order for them to change. And this can be small things as buying one thing or the other, or things we call like the endowment effect, things that I own, I value them more. If you've ever been to a Loppis, to one of these flea markets where people then try to sell old things at ridiculous prices because it means something to them and not so much to others. So that would be also in that category of perceiving something that we already have as much more valuable as something else. So that often is a barrier to change, or being afraid to ask questions because we might be seen as not as smart. So that also falls in this area of loss aversion. Then next we have something we call cognitive load, and this is a bigger category of saying, okay, there's so many things that are going on in our brains and decisions we have to make. So when we're faced with, for example, too many choices, we go, we want to buy some new shoes, and we go into the store and there's just so many things we can choose from that can lead to us not making a decision at all, because it's just too difficult to decide between all these different options. And this also relates to the idea of general inattention. If we can only think about one thing at a time, and so we end up forgetting things or not paying so much attention. I think a very nice example of how to counter that, if we think about people like Barack Obama or Mark Zuckerberg, who usually wear very simple clothes and usually always the same. So it's part of the brand, but if you look at somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, who always has a gray t-shirt and jeans on, it's also about just simplifying decisions. And Barack Obama was actually quoted saying, it's like, I have to make so many different decisions every day. I can't be bothered to also make decisions about my clothes. So that doesn't mean that some people don't care about their clothes, but then they maybe have the same breakfast every morning, because that's one way of simplifying the decision making. So that would be this whole question of cognitive load, which is a strong bias. Then we have social norms. I think all listeners will know about this, right? We care a lot about what other people think and how they perceive us. And even if it's not consciously, but there's these fun experiments where people stand in an elevator and then they have these two actors and they stand facing the back of the elevators away from the doors, which is usually not what we normally do. And then you see people getting into the elevator who don't know this is an experiment, and then you see them all also turning to the back of the elevator. So we see that subconsciously even we're influenced by what other people do, or if you see some people getting in a queue somewhere, some random people will start getting into that queue as well, even though they don't even know where it leads to. And then lastly, kind of my favorite bias, or the one that I work with most in my research, is about the idea of impulsivity, and just we call this present bias. So the idea that I overvalue my present gratification versus my long-term well-being. So I want that cookie now. I don't want to work on that assignment I have to do, exactly. Or I'll exercise after work. Right now I'm still too tired. I'm going to press the snooze button. So these things where we know that our 15 minutes from now person is not going to be very happy that we pressed the snooze button, but the one who just woke up really wants to press that snooze button, and then we know we're going to get delayed later on, so we're going to be upset with our previous self for doing this, and then next morning the same thing happens again, right? So if it just happens one time, we're not going to call it bias, but if it happens again and again, and we become aware that this is a pattern, but we still can't break it, then we also know that we have that type of bias.
Yeah, this is something I can also relate to. I must say, pressing the snooze button, and I know, of course, the 15 minutes later waking up Hannah is going to be so mad at the previous Hannah, just because I know these kind of rituals, as you say, like, simplifying your day in the sense of having a morning routine, having an evening routine is so important. But sometimes to just, adhere to that routine is so difficult, because as you say, it's very uncomfortable, of course, to get up a little bit earlier, to do your morning workout, to do your meditation, to go for a run. And as we do completely overvalue the present moment, it becomes a bit difficult to adhere to some of these rituals, or, when we talk about health outcomes, of course, to treatments that might be beneficial for us in the long term. Do you have a small little example here of a nudge that I could use, for example, if I really want to make sure that my morning ritual is going to be maintained, and I kind of can counteract my lazy Hannah in the morning that just wants to press the snooze button?
So I think the best nudges here, if you are self-aware and can set them for yourself, are really any types of commitment devices. So that would be, right, that you don't have your phone directly next to your bed, but you actually have it across the room. So that means in order to turn it off, you actually have to get out of bed, have to walk over there, and then press the button. And your evening self, right, the evening Hannah wants you to get up in the morning. So putting that somewhere else could be one thing, or scheduling, I don't know, a morning run with a friend, right? That would be the also typical example, right? You don't really want to go running right now when you wake up, but you also don't want to have your friends standing there by themselves without you coming there. Or or maybe when it comes to, right, having a healthy breakfast. So maybe you want to pre-cut some fruit or make a smoothie in the evening if you're too tired in the morning, but then you already have something set. So the more you can think about, okay, what are these barriers I'm going to encounter next morning and where I don't feel like doing this? So how can I reduce friction in some way? So that would be, already preparing a smoothie so you can have that instead of something unhealthy. Or how can I, increase friction, so make it more difficult to turn something off? So that would, being putting the alarm clock across the room, or saying you're going to meet up with a friend, because then that's going to create guilt, or the fact that you're already out of bed. So I think in that way, and that might be a bit different for every person, but try to think about, can I make some behavior that I don't want to do harder to do? And can I make some behavior that I do want to do easier to do? And that's going to work in most cases to set this up. But I'm an experimental economist, so I would always suggest, right, do some experiments on yourself. Try and see whether it works. And does that help you enough? Or maybe you need a different type of nudge. And that's also what we do even when designing policies, right? We try different things, and then to understand what works, and don't get too discouraged if maybe the first try didn't work out as planned, and maybe that just wasn't enough.
That's a really great insight. I think just these small little things sometimes can make such a big difference, especially when we talk about, taking good care of your mental well-being. It can be this little thing, setting up a ritual in the morning and in the evening, and trying to facilitate the environment so that you really are kind of forcing yourself, or just incentivized to remove the friction, as you say, to really adhere to these rituals. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the costs of using nudges as a tool to influence behavior, particularly when we talk about health behavior?
Exactly. So I've done some research on this. I have a paper called The Hidden Cost of Nudging, and that's exactly where we're trying to understand this and saying, well, in some way we, yes, want to help people change behavior, but sometimes also the techniques we might use, right? Even just the putting the phone across the room and then you have to get up in the morning. I mean, it is also a little bit uncomfortable. So if you do that for yourself, then that's perfectly fine, right? But if the state or the company tries to help you, and yes, you might actually be happy that you got up on time and actually managed to do everything you wanted to do, but it also can have these negative costs sometimes. So I work a lot with reminders, and when it comes to reminders, yes, they can be helpful if I forgot something, but they can also be incredibly annoying, right? If we get the emails we get, oh, have you sent this in and you should do this? And what we talked about earlier during the podcast is about, when do they come, at which point of time, and is that then the right time when I can actually act? And what we've seen there is that we worked with this charity and tried to see, okay, if we send people donation reminders and say, hey, you said you want to donate to the charity, do you want to donate now? Yes, people will donate, but we also see a lot of people then unsubscribing. And from that, we understand that we then, yes, these people signed up to the list. They said they wanted to be reminded, but then once we remind them, some people still get annoyed at that. And what we then try to do is in a different study where we worked with pregnant women in South Africa, reminding them to take their prenatal vitamins. So in charitable giving, you might say, yeah, but maybe people don't want to necessarily want to donate. They just said they wanted to. But if you think about, okay, but if you're pregnant and you're told that you're supposed to take prenatal vitamins for yourself and for your child, then we can be pretty sure that this is in the best interest of the individuals we're trying to nudge through sending daily reminders. So there we wanted to see whether people would also get annoyed at those. Generally, luckily, most women seem to be quite happy about the reminders, but we do see if we add too much additional information, this would be like, oh, don't take the reminder with coffee, or don't take the pill with coffee, or don't eat cheese when you're taking these iron supplements, or these type of things. We actually saw that had a bit of a negative effect. So it seems that maybe people found this patronizing potentially, or they already had this information. But if they already only had the information, it shouldn't really matter, because if I already know something, I'm being told it again, it could be fine. But potentially it could have this negative effect as well. So I think we always want to be very careful when we design nudges to think about, okay, what might be the backlash, or how are we maybe also taking attention away from other things. So yes, it might be good to take the medication at the right point of time, but maybe you also need to think about getting your kid to school on time, or maybe you also need to, I don't know, get the water into the house, or you need to do other things. And if we're exogenously sending these reminders and trying to get the attention to a particular thing, we see this a lot with sustainability questions. Yes, it's important to reduce food waste, and it's good if you, I don't know, buy paper bags instead of plastic bags, but we are also taking the attention away from other things people might be thinking about at that moment. And then the question is that really going to be optimal overall? So it was any type of nudge, we want to be careful that what we think is in the best interest of the person we're trying to nudge is truly in their best interest. And that is not always going to be the case for everybody.
That's a really great point, I think, to highlight, is that we don't only have the benefits from nudges, but we have to carefully also take into consideration what type of costs do we have? What type of backlash can we encounter? And as you say, if it comes from like the top to the bottom, it can be easily seen as a little bit of too much of an influencing strategy, right? Than something that I design according to my preferences, according to my own priorities. You're also now, Christina, the co-founder of Impactually, a management consultancy that aspires to create impact by teaching people about behavioral science. What types of strategies and concepts do you use when designing a nudge?
So we work with what we call the boost model, and that's what we use for all our courses, but also for all our consulting projects. And it is the scientific process of working with nudging and behavior change, but applied to a bit more of a practical situation, so people who are not PhDs in economics can work with that and with everyday challenges. So the way it goes is that the B stands for behavior, and the first thing we want to do is we want to define the behavior we want to change. And this is often where the first people stumble, because think, oh, we want people to care more about the environment, but that's not actually behavior. Turning off the lights when you leave the room, that's a behavior. So being very precise about what's the behavior you want to change, because only then will tools from behavioral science be actually relevant here. So then next we want to think about the obstacles, and these are the behavioral biases we just talked about. Is it about social norms? Is it about present bias? Because depending on what actually the challenges are, right? The getting out of bed, is that that's probably a present bias thing, not a social norm thing, right? You probably don't care if other people in other households, they get out of bed on time. I mean, maybe people might care about this, but probably not. So using a social norm and saying other people don't press the snooze button, personally, I don't think that will be a great thing. So I think it's probably better to use to putting the phone across the room. So that would be that phase. And then the next one is outline, where we then think about, okay, based on the barriers we've identified, which are then the right interventions to do. And then we usually come up with 2 or 3 different ones we might want to test. And then the fourth part is study. And I think this is also something that's too often skipped. Often we believe, and also especially in consulting, that people will come and say, the right answer is X, this is what you should do. But we try to be very careful and say, well, we don't know this for sure either. Human behavior is incredibly complex. We, using this process, can come up with some good hypotheses of what we think is going to work. But in order to be sure that it works, we need to actually then test it in an experiment and actually see how much does it affect behavior, and does it actually matter? Or maybe it does matter, but it's just such a small effect that the all amount of money you're going to spend on that intervention is actually not really useful. You should actually spend that money on trying to do something else. And then the last step, the T in the boost, is tailor. And that will be, once we have those results, yeah, we would then have these questions. Okay, is it worth it to scale it up? Do we need to adjust it a bit? So how can we go from that maybe pilot experiment we did to a more general outcome? And whether you use nudging or whether you use other type of behavioral informed incentives, this boost model kind of works with all these things, because it really forces people to focus on this, especially the second part. What are the barriers, and how is what I'm trying to do really affecting these barriers that I've identified?
Wow, yeah, the boost model, that is a really interesting and very easy to remember concept. I think it's a great name, and something that I will definitely take as a great recommendation. As you say, to first think about what is actually the behavior that we want to change. And this is always really important, I do think, is that we know exactly what we want to change, and something that we can quantify, right? I can actually measure how often is it that I forget then to switch off the lights. This is something we can look at in more detail. So that's a really great model to have in place. Having talked now about behavioral science and the toolbox of nudging, you are a female behavioral scientist and economics professor. Getting a bit more personal here, what are some of the challenges that you encounter as a woman behavioral scientist and economics professor?
So I would say I'm quite lucky that behavioral science is a pretty strong female field. Economics, not so much, right? So the behavioral science part, also behavioral economics, I think there's a lot of also already amazing, more junior, but some amazing women in that field. economics is still very male dominated. So in my daily life, of course, we have now at the University of Copenhagen, we now have 2 full professors in economics. So doubled from one from January now on. So I think that is maybe compared to finance or some more tech industries, that is something you're usually always in the minority as a woman, which I don't think is necessarily always a problem, but it is that just norms of how maybe you talk to each other and how you interact is more often shaped by a bit more male environment. I think secondly, and this probably is not just applies for women, but I find it interesting, or academia in general, it is a very competitive field because you always compete with the whole world, right? So it is similar to playing a sport on the world level, or being maybe an artist or something on the global level, because the way that we get promoted is by publishing articles in journals, and these journals have a number of slots every year where you can publish articles, but every Nobel Prize winner who's still alive also tries publishing these journals. So, and every top US researcher with a gigantic research team also tries to publish in these journals. So everything you do, you're always competing on that international stage. And I think this is also something that, can definitely be challenging, I'm sure, for men as well as for women. But it is sometimes that, we know from research that often women don't appreciate or this competition in the same way that some men actually strive in it. So some of them actually truly enjoy the idea of this very competitive environment. And I think that is something that at least I personally don't love about it. I think you have to somehow get used to it. You have to get used to all the rejections. I think I'm now close to 100 journal rejections. So all these projects I've done, you work on a project for 5 years, and then you try for another 2 or 3 years to get it published. So those, I think, are all things you need to be very resilient and be okay with that. It's competitive, and that the feedback 80% of the time is going to be negative. But then when it does work out, then you also really feel like you've achieved something.
Wow, that's, as you say, that's great persistence that you need. I mean, working on something for 5 years and then another 2 years, and then still the high chance of for it to be rejected is quite is quite crazy. And I think this is something we all kind of have as a perception from academia, right? That it is as you say, a world level playing field. So you need to be sure that you have the resilience to persevere in that field. Coming to the end of this podcast, what are some of your recommendations, the brain foods that you would like to pass on to our community of listeners? Maybe they either aspire to use, design, or implement their own little nudges for better health outcomes or for better financial outcomes.
Yeah, so I already said this, but I believe a lot in experimentation and trying different things, and not trying to think that if I just think about it hard enough, I'm going to come up with a perfect solution, and being more okay with this idea that I'll try something, I'll see how it goes. If it doesn't work out, then I'll try something a little bit different. But again, also not just randomly trying different things. So I think it does make sense to use something. You can use a boost model, you can use other types of models in this area, but really trying to think about, okay, what are really the barriers for me to change my behavior, and what can I then maybe try out to try to either, as I said, reduce friction if it's something that I really want to do, or increase friction if it's something that I don't think I should be doing as much of. And I think if we just start at that point, this increasing and reducing friction, that can already go a long way in changing behaviors in the long term.
That's a great recommendation. Christina, I'm only left to say thank you for being part of Brain Fruits. It was a great pleasure to have you. We have some great insights, and I'm sure that we have now a lot of our community listeners here that know what a nudge is, and that start thinking about how to use it in their personal lives to have better well-being outcomes. So that's really great. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And if any of the listeners want to get in touch I'm quite active on Twitter and also on LinkedIn. So I'm also super happy to give recommendations or chat or engage with the audience.
Wow, that's super great to hear. I'm sure that there will be quite a few that take advantage of that offering.
Sure.